for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Ms. Maloney, I wanted to actually start with you. I've listened to your comments and I've read earlier testimony. Am I correct in making the statement that you don't believe this was either a ransom or an exchange for prisoners, the $400 million?
What I believe is that the timing of the release of the prisoners was coordinated with the timing of the resolution of this long-held financial dispute between the two countries. I do not believe it was a coincidence.
You do not believe it was a coincidence? I
do not, and I believe that that is in fact consistent with exactly what the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration did in seeking the release of Americans who were held hostage and other Westerners held hostages in Lebanon in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This is the sort of diplomacy that the United States is engaged in time and time again with Iran. It doesn't always pay off. It didn't pay off as we had hoped with the release of hostages from Lebanon. It did, in this case, clearly pay off with the release of the 4 Americans and a 5th American who had been held at the same time.
At a cost of $400 million?
At a cost of resolving a debt that we would have had to resolve irrespective of the release of those Americans. I would rather clear the underbrush, as President Bush said when he talked about very similar actions back in the late 1980s, and see the return of Americans who were being held unjustly, than to resolve a debt and not see the return of these same Americans.
Do you believe that there was any discussion of the prisoner exchange in the JCPOA?
I believe what I have read in the media consistently, which is that Secretary Kerry and those officials who were engaged in the negotiations raised the case of these Americans time and time again on every occasion when they met with their Iranian counterparts.
So it's likely as part of that Iran deal, there is discussion about a return of prisoners, and there also coincidentally at the same time is a discussion about $400 or $1.3 billion payment.
The negotiations that go on at the U.S.-Iran Claims Tribunal are very much separate and distinct, I think, from the broader
diplomatic...
You just
said Secretary Kerry brought it up at every single...
At the nuclear negotiations, yes.
Okay,
he brought up the status of American prisoners in Iran.
Okay, so that's my question. While Secretary Kerry, under the direction of President Obama, is negotiating with Iran on the JCPOA, they brought up at every moment, as you said, every possible option and chance to release prisoners. And it sounds like, as a result of that agreement, there was a $1.7 billion payment made. Now, I understand that you're saying there's a tribunal that has to be addressed, so that's their justification for a ransom payment.
The deliberations of the tribunal have been going on now for 35 years. They occur through very separate channels, very separate personnel from those who were involved with the negotiations over the nuclear deal or those who were involved with the negotiations over the... So
35 years of negotiations, and this is the moment that Secretary Kerry and President Obama decide to make a $1.7 billion transfer?
We have paid out judgments as part of the U.S.-Iran Claims Tribunal.
Do you think there was a judgment that was imminent?
As the Iranians have paid to us.
Do you think there was a judgment that was going to be imminent?
The previous panel debated the use of the word imminent. I don't have any way to gauge whether it was or was not. What I do believe is what the State Department Legal Advisor's Office testified at the previous panel, which was that they believed that this compromise agreement was in the interest of the American people, that it was in fact represented a lower figure than what the Iranians had been demanding, and that it was worthwhile to
I've heard their... No, I appreciate that. Reclaiming my time. I've heard their excuse, and I've heard their rationale. I just don't believe it, nor do the American people. Do you know what the President Obama's administration position is on private citizens paying ransom internationally?
I'm very familiar with the prohibition's longstanding policy against payment of ransom for release of hostages abroad, and I think it is a wise policy that ought to be defended. I do not believe in this case that a ransom was in fact paid. I believe that economic leverage was used as part of a broader diplomatic engagement with an adversarial state.
I mean, when you look at this screen, $33.6 billion in cash. What economic leverage?
I don't believe that we have evidence that $33.6 billion was paid in cash to Iran.
Okay, so what dollar amount do we have evidence of was paid to Iran, in your opinion, if it's not 33.6?
We have evidence, and we know from the Wall Street Journal, that a payment was made in foreign currency cash to Tehran in the case of the resolution of this financial dispute in January and early February of this year, and that was a total of $1.7 billion.
Thank you very much.